At my daughter's housewarming party, my son-in-law stood up in front of 60 people and announced I had agreed to sign over my grandfather's workshop to him. When I told him I'd agreed to no such thing, he smiled at the room and said, "See, this is what I was telling you all about." He forgets. I set my glass down on the nearest table, walked out the front door and called one person. When my son-in-law found out who was on the other end of that call, he stopped smiling for a very long time. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of this and drop a comment with your city or state. I want to see how far this story has traveled." The party was at their new house in Concord, New Hampshire, a 4-bedroom colonial that my son-in-law had bought 6 months earlier with what I later learned was borrowed money he couldn't comfortably afford. My daughter had decorated every room with fresh flowers and those little chalkboard signs that say things like "Gather" and "Home is where the heart is." She'd worked hard to make the place feel warm. I remember watching her arrange a fruit platter in the kitchen and thinking she looked happy. I wanted to believe she was. I should back up. My name is Wade. I'm 63 years old and I'm a third-generation woodworker. My grandfather built his first workshop outside Concord in 1952. My father took it over in 1979. I took it over when his knees gave out in 2001, the same year my wife Opal was first diagnosed. The workshop, formerly called Hargrove and Sons Custom Woodwork, though I dropped the Sons when my brother moved to Florida and decided he wanted nothing to do with sawdust or New Hampshire winters, has been in the same location for over 70 years. We've built furniture, cabinetry, staircases, mantels, state houses, old churches, private homes. We've done work that will outlast all of us. Opal died 7 years ago. Breast cancer, stage 4 by the time they caught it. She was 54 years old, and she was the most practical, warm-hearted woman I have ever known. When she died, I was left with a mountain of medical debt, a daughter who was 27 and living in Boston, and a workshop I wasn't sure I could afford to keep running. That's when Nadine entered the picture. But I'll get to that. My daughter met my son-in-law at a fundraiser in Boston about 4 years ago. He wore a navy blazer and knew how to work a room. The first time she brought him up to visit, he spent more time asking about the property than he did talking to me. He walked around the shop with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ceiling beams, the way people look at things when they're calculating. "This place has real potential," he said. "That's how people who flip properties talk about things that belong to other people." I smiled politely and changed the subject. For the first year, his interest in the workshop felt like curiosity. The questions were casual enough. "How many acres? Is the road easement documented? Do you have the original deed?" I gave short answers and figured he was just the kind of man who liked to know the details of things. A lot of people in real estate are like that. They can't turn it off. But around the time they got engaged, the questions changed. "Dad, he thinks it might make sense to look at transferring some of the property into my name." My daughter mentioned one evening over the phone. "For estate planning purposes." I said we'd have plenty of time to think about estate planning. "He says there are real tax advantages if you do it while you're still healthy." There it was. While you're still healthy. I was 61 at the time. I'd hiked 14 miles the previous October with a group from the local trail club. My doctor told me my blood pressure was that of a man 20 years younger. But the implication had been planted, and planted things grow whether you tend them or not. After the engagement, my son-in-law started coming up to the shop alone. He'd show up on weekday afternoons when my daughter was at work in Boston and I'd be finishing a commission. He'd lean against the doorframe and ask questions. "What would you do if you had to sell? How's the cash flow been this year? Do you have a succession plan?" I started keeping a notebook. Every date, every question, everything he told me I had apparently said that I had no memory of saying. According to him, I had told him I was open to exploring options for the property. I had told him I was thinking about stepping back. I had said that my daughter deserved to know what she was inheriting. Every one of these things was news to me. What worried me more was that my daughter was starting to repeat them. "Dad, you mentioned to him that you might be ready to slow down." "Dad, he said you seemed confused when he visited last Tuesday." Last Tuesday, I had been building a walnut mantelpiece for a client in Exeter. That kind of work requires a level of precision that confusion does not permit. But I didn't say that. I just listened and made more notes. I called 3 people during those months of preparation. The first was my attorney, who has handled my affairs since 1999. I asked whether anyone had contacted his office about property transfers. He said no. Then I explained the pressure I'd been getting, and he said very quietly, "Come in this week." The second call was to my doctor. I asked for a full cognitive evaluation, the complete battery, along with a comprehensive physical. She sounded puzzled. I explained what my son-in-law had been telling people about my mental state. She said, "I'll schedule you immediately." The results came back excellent across the board. Perfect cognitive function, blood pressure and physical capability well above average for my age group. I had her put everything in writing and kept it in the safe in my office, along with everything else I was accumulating. The third call was to a private investigator my attorney recommended. What he turned up over the following 2 months was not a surprise, but it was thorough. My son-in-law had a pattern of failed real estate partnerships, 3 in the past decade, each one leaving his investors short while he walked away with finder's fees. He was under investigation by the New Hampshire Real Estate Commission for misrepresenting property disclosures on a commercial sale in Manchester. He owed close to $180,000 across personal credit cards and lines of credit. And a developer out of Boston, a firm called Grayfield Capital, had been making inquiries about the Hargrove Workshop property for months. Their preliminary interest figure, $2.8 million, contingent on the land being available for commercial redevelopment. My son-in-law had been in talks with them since before their wedding. I don't know how much my daughter knew. I want to believe it was nothing. Even now, I want to believe that. The housewarming was a Saturday in April. About 60 people, neighbors, her college friends, his colleagues from the city, and several of my old friends from the trail club, whom my son-in-law had personally called and invited. I understood later why he wanted them there. He wanted familiar faces in that room. He wanted people I had known for 30 years to witness whatever he was about to do. An hour into the party, he clinked a glass and gave a toast. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about the new house. He talked about building a life with my daughter. And then he said, "We've got some exciting family news. Wade has agreed to officially bring the Hargrove Workshop into the family as a wedding gift. A little late coming, and we couldn't be more grateful." He reached into the jacket hanging over his chair and produced a manila folder. The room applauded. I set my glass down. "That's not accurate," I said, keeping my voice level. "I haven't agreed to anything like that." He smiled, not at me, at the room. "There he goes," he said, with that patient, indulgent tone you use with someone who is becoming a burden. "We talked about this, Wade, at the shop 3 weeks ago." We did not. "He does this," he continued, still addressing the guests, "forgets whole conversations. Honestly, we've been a little worried. It's been getting more frequent." I looked at my daughter. She was standing near the kitchen doorway, her hands pressed together, her face tight. She didn't say anything to contradict him. She didn't step forward to stand beside me. She looked like a woman who had heard this narrative many times and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. And in that moment I saw something that hurt more than anything else in that room. She looked like she half believed it. "This is not something I agreed to," I said, loudly and clearly enough for everyone present. "And I will not be signing anything tonight." My son-in-law's smile went thinner. "Wade, enjoy your party," I said. I walked out the front door. The April air was cold and clean. I stood on the step for a moment, listening to the muffled sound of 60 people deciding where to look. Then I took out my phone and called Nadine Beaumont. 20 years ago, I was drowning. Opal had been sick for 14 months, and the medical bills were stacked on my kitchen table like something from a nightmare. The workshop was profitable, but not profitable enough. Not for out-of-network specialists, not for experimental treatment protocols, not for what we were attempting to do to save her. I had mortgaged the property twice, and I was 3 months from the bank beginning foreclosure proceedings. My father was still alive then, living in a care facility outside Concord, and the thought of losing the workshop while he was still breathing was what kept me awake every night. That spring, I received a letter from an organization called the Craftsman's Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit based in Portsmouth dedicated to preserving working craft traditions throughout New England. They had identified the Hargrove Workshop as one of 17 historically significant working craftsmen's properties in the state, and they wanted to discuss an arrangement. Nadine Beaumont was their director. She drove up from Portsmouth in a gray sedan and sat across from me at the shop's work table with a cup of coffee in a manner that was direct without being unkind. She explained what the foundation offered. They would purchase the property outright at fair market value, which at the time resolved every immediate financial problem I had, and I would remain as the working master craftsman under a long-term management agreement. To the outside world, nothing would change. I would run the shop. I would take on commissions. I would pay myself a salary from operating revenue, with the foundation covering major capital expenses and property taxes. Their interest was preservation, not profit. They didn't want to develop the property or sell it. They wanted the Hargrove workshop to keep making things the way it had been making things since 1952. The agreement gave them right of first refusal on any future sale, required board approval for any change in use, and granted me, and any family member I designated, the right to eventually purchase the property back at a negotiated price based on current market value. I asked why they would do this. She said there were donors who believed working craft traditions were part of the American heritage worth protecting, the same way people preserved historic buildings or old-growth forests. They didn't need a financial return. They needed to know what they cared about was still standing. I signed the agreement that same week. For 20 years, the arrangement was invisible. The foundation paid property taxes. I ran the shop. Quarterly, I had a call with their board. The property's legal ownership was recorded with the county under the foundation's name, but nobody had ever had a reason to look it up. To everyone who knew me, I was the Hargrove workshop. I had tried 3 times to tell my daughter, once when she was 22, once when she graduated college, once when she got serious with her first long-term partner. Each time something intervened, a bad moment, a conversation that went sideways, an occasion that felt wrong. I kept thinking there was time. I kept believing it wouldn't matter until it mattered. My son-in-law made it matter. Nadine answered on the second ring. I gave her the short version. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'll be there Monday with the full board. Don't sign a single thing, wait." I said I wouldn't. "Are you all right?" I was cold and furious and tired, but I was standing in one piece outside a house that wasn't mine, in air that smelled like mud and pine, and there was something clarifying about that. "I will be," I said. On Sunday, my son-in-law called 3 times. I let all 3 go to voicemail. His messages moved through stages, apologetic, explanatory, and finally something that edged toward threatening while keeping the language careful enough to avoid any clear line. He was worried about me. He was trying to plan responsibly for the future. He had an obligation to my daughter to think practically about these things. Sunday evening, my daughter called. I answered. She sounded exhausted. "Dad, I'm sorry about the party." "Which part?" She was quiet for a moment. "He told 60 people I have memory problems," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He produced paperwork for a transfer I never agreed to." "That's not a misunderstanding, sweetheart." "He says you did agree." "He says." "I know what he says. I've been writing it down for 8 months. I wasn't angry with her. What I felt was sadder than anger. I need you to trust me one more time. Come to the shop Monday morning. Come alone." She came. The foundation's board arrived at 9:30 in 2 vehicles. Nadine led them in, 4 people, all with the quiet, unhurried manner of individuals who have genuine authority and no need to perform it. Their attorney, their executive director, their preservation officer, and a representative from the State Historic Preservation Office in Concord, who had made the drive specifically because of what Nadine had shared with her on Friday. My daughter sat at the old work table and listened. She didn't say a word for the first 20 minutes. The foundation's attorney laid out the ownership structure without editorial comment, the property deed, the management agreement, the protective covenant that required board approval for any change in use or ownership transfer. The woman from the state office explained that the Hargrove workshop had been formally listed on the New Hampshire Register of Historic Places since 2018, a designation that added another legal layer against demolition or commercial conversion. My son-in-law had been attempting to arrange the sale of a property he had no standing to touch, protected by covenants he'd never known existed, to a developer whose plans would have been blocked before a single permit was filed. "He's been in contact with Grayfield Capital," Nadine said, sliding a folder across the table. "These are the email chains our attorney obtained through a cease and desist review. He's been negotiating with them for 5 months. The figure he quoted them was $2.6 million. His arrangement, a finder's fee structured through a personal LLC, would have been $180,000. My daughter picked up the folder. I watched her read. I watched the exact moment she understood that her husband hadn't been careless or overeager or simply misguided about the property's value. He had been deliberate. Every time he'd mentioned my forgetfulness in front of friends, every worried look he'd put on when my name came up, every gentle suggestion that her father was struggling. All of it had been preparation for a transaction he'd been planning since before they were married. She set the folder down carefully, the way you handle something when your hands aren't entirely steady. My son-in-law arrived at 10:15. He'd texted my daughter that he was stopping by to check on things, which I believe was his way of resuming the pressure campaign he thought was still working. He pulled into the gravel lot, got out of his car, and stopped when he saw the unfamiliar vehicles and the faces visible through the shop windows. I met him at the door. "What's going on?" he said. "Come inside." He came in. He looked at Nadine. He looked at the attorney, at the state official, at the full board. He looked at my daughter, who did not look back at him. "I'm Nadine Beaumont," she said, "executive director of the Craftsman's Heritage Foundation. We own this property." The color left his face in stages, the way low tide uncovers what the water was hiding. The next 40 minutes were the quietest I can remember. The foundation's attorney walked my son-in-law through the legal reality of his situation, with the measured patience of someone who has done this before and has no interest in making it theatrical. The transfer he had been pursuing was impossible. The developer deal was dead. The cease and desist had already been filed, and separately, because the foundation's attorney had made a call to the State Real Estate Commission on Friday afternoon. The existing investigation into my son-in-law for property disclosure fraud had been updated with the new information about his activity regarding the Hargrove property. He didn't shout. The swagger was entirely gone. He sat in the chair across from Nadine and looked at the table and said, in a voice I barely recognized, "What do you want?" "We want you to walk away from this property permanently," she said. "Written documentation that you make no further claims on any assets associated with the Hargrove workshop or its management agreement, and we want you to understand clearly that we will be watching." He signed what they put in front of him. When he stood to leave, he looked at my daughter. Whatever he was hoping to find in her face, it wasn't there. She was looking at the folder, her hand resting flat on the cover. He left without a word. The sound of his car on the gravel faded out, and the shop was very quiet. That evening, my daughter and I sat on the old bench outside the workshop, the same bench my grandfather built in 1961 from leftover white oak. The light was fading over the tree line. The air smelled like sawdust and spring mud, the way it always has. She had a mug of tea going cold between her hands. "How long did you know?" she asked. "About him?" 8 months, more or less. "About the foundation's ownership?" 20 years. "You should have told me. About the foundation, I mean, a long time ago." "Yes," I said, "I should have." She was quiet for a while, watching a pair of crows settle into the far tree line. "He told me you were losing it. He said it so many times and so carefully that I started watching for signs. I'd call you and listen for repetition, for gaps, and you were completely fine. You were sharp as you've always been, and I was looking for something that wasn't there because he had told me where to look. He was very good at it. I should have trusted you over him." I didn't say anything to that. She already knew it, and saying it again wouldn't have helped either of us. She filed for separation the following week. The legal process took time, but he didn't fight it in any meaningful way. He had other problems demanding his attention by then. The Real Estate Commission suspended his license pending the outcome of their investigation. Grayfield Capital quietly pursued other opportunities. Last I heard through my attorney, he had moved back to his parents' place in Connecticut. That's not the kind of dramatic ending that makes for a satisfying final scene, but it is the appropriate one for a man like that. Life deflates them rather than destroying them, and deflation is probably the more fitting consequence. My daughter has been coming up on weekends. She's been learning finish work, the final sanding and staining that takes rough wood and turns it into something you'd want to live with. She has her mother's patience for the slow parts of things, which is the most important quality a woodworker can have, and not something you can teach. Either it's there or it isn't. Last fall, I had a long conversation with Nadine and the foundation's board about my daughter, eventually assuming my management role. The response was warm, as it should be. The Hargroves have been good stewards of this property for over 70 years, and the foundation has always understood that stewardship is the point. What my son-in-law wanted was to take something built slowly over generations and convert it into quick money to cover debts he'd spent years accumulating. He thought he was being practical. He believed that a 63-year-old man's attachment to a drafty woodshop was the only thing standing between him and a clean financial slate. He thought if he could just move that one obstacle, me, everything else would fall into place. He didn't know about the foundation. He didn't know about Nadine. He didn't know the property had more protection around it than he could see, or that the people who cared about preserving it had more resources and more patience than he had ever calculated. He thought the weakness was me. That's always the mistake men like him make. They look at what's visible and decide they understand the whole picture. They never think to ask what's underneath, what was built quietly, in hard years, by people who weren't looking for recognition. They see an old man with a workshop and they think, easy. They never ask what that old man did when the water was rising and nobody was watching. The shop opens at 7 tomorrow morning. There's a commission due at the end of the month. A staircase in quarter sawn oak for a restoration project in Portsmouth. And the lumber came in last week. It's sitting in the drying shed right now, pale and clean and patient, the way good wood always is. I'll be in there at 6:30, same as always. That's the only answer I've ever needed.